The identity of Satoshi Nakamoto, the supposed founder and creator of Bitcoin, is one of the most revered mysteries in all of cryptocurrencies. Our next guest claims that he knows Satoshi very well. He's well acquainted with who he actually is, and he has proof and evidence of why he thinks this particular person is Satoshi. We'll get into that with Kurt Worker Jr. He is a Bitcoin historian, and he has followed the crypto markets for many, many years and has an inside track on who Satoshi may really be. Kurt, welcome to the show.
Thank you, David.
Kurt, let's talk about yourself first and why it is that you've become known as the Bitcoin historian, and we'll talk about the rest of the story as it unfolds.
I guess the shortest answer is I've been around a long time. I've been a Bitcoiner since 2012. I've been involved in infrastructure consulting. I ran a mining operation in 2013 to 15. Been in software development, cybersecurity, but always had Bitcoin as one of the things I was up to. I'm also was involved for a time in like mining Ethereum and Monero and some other things. So I just kind of have a pretty wide grasp of the crypto space. And ultimately, I work as sort of a storyteller now. I get to sort of right the wrongs and talk about all the stuff that people don't really talk about anymore. But I experienced a lot of it. I know a lot of the people that are big players today from back when they weren't much. And so I read a column. I do a weekly live stream, take live Q&A, and I like to tell the history. So that's what I am.
You're like me. You're a journalist focusing on the crypto space with obviously a more storied history, pun intended, of following the space and much more knowledgeable than I am, I'll have to admit. So Kurt, let's talk about how it is you follow the space. So primary information, you have a lot of contacts within the space. Tell us how it is that you've become acquainted with people like Craig Wright.
Sure. So in 2015, the Bitcoin scaling war got really heated up. So it was big blockers versus small blockers. How should Bitcoin scale? What is Bitcoin even for? And there was basically just a long fight. It's still ongoing. Ultimately, Bitcoin split into BTC and Bitcoin Cash. And then the Bitcoin Cash community split up into BCH and BSV. I'm a big BSV supporter by default because I like big blocks, and BSV is the biggest block implementation of Bitcoin, which means basically it has the lowest fees and the most capacity. It's the most frictionless version of Bitcoin to use in commerce. It's closely associated with Dr. Craig Wright. And so I've just kind of become a friend, colleague, acquaintance by de facto, but he was not my first choice of guys to just, be friends with and hang out. But we happen to agree very fundamentally about the Bitcoin protocol. And so here we are.
All right, we're going to talk about BSV towards the end of the interview. But let's, before we get into the case, who is Craig Wright?
Well, Dr. Craig Wright is the chief scientist at a research and development firm called Enchain in the UK. He's one of the most decorated cybersecurity professionals of all time. He's an author, he's an academic, he's a whole bunch of things. And I happen to believe that he is also Satoshi Nakamoto, the creator of Bitcoin.
Okay, let's talk about that. Let's talk about the case first. So the recent case involving Craig Wright and David Kleiman.
Yep.
Now, the Miami jury did rule in favor of Dr. Wright. Give us a primer and backstory of this court case.
Sure. So in 2013, Dave Kleiman died. Dave Kleiman was a mostly unknown computer scientist and digital forensics expert. He wrote a few white papers with Craig Wright. The biggest one was the drive wipe fallacy white paper. But ultimately, Dave was a pretty simple dude from South Florida, worked well, did his stuff. He was well known in certain circles, but he, in fact, called himself some guy named Dave. And this was in stark comparison to Dr. Craig Wright, who was his best friend in life and a colleague in a great many things. They authored books and white papers together. But when Dave died, Dave's brother, Ira Kleiman, got it in his head that Dave must have helped Craig create Bitcoin because they partnered on so many things. And ultimately, after a couple of years of bickering, Ira, representing the Dave Kleiman estate, sued Craig Wright for 1.1 million Bitcoins, which is an estimate of how many Bitcoins were mined by Satoshi Nakamoto in the first 2 years of Bitcoin's existence. And it's been in litigation since 2018 and just wrapped up on Monday of this week.
Okay. Now, did Kleiman assist Craig Wright in writing the original Bitcoin white paper?
So maybe not in writing. It's actually a little unclear. Craig Wright was happy to admit that Craig wrote.
Well,
yeah,
okay,
go ahead.
sorry. Continue.
Yeah, so Craig Wright was happy to admit that Craig wrote the original draft or drafts and that it went to Dave for final editing. And this was their ongoing long-time relationship, is that Craig would write out some high-level computer science academic mumbo-jumbo, and then he would give it to Dave because Dave was really good at translating high-level stuff to something that could be read at a lower level, a little more generalist. And so that's what Craig said he did with Dave, and there really wasn't any evidence to the contrary. Obviously, Ira Kleiman is saying no. Like Dave helped code, write the first Bitcoin code and helped write the first white paper and blah blah blah. But ultimately, the evidence for that was non-existent, and ultimately, Craig Wright was vindicated in that.
Well, Kurt, my earlier question rested on the assumption that Craig Wright was indeed the author of the original Bitcoin white paper. Do we have any evidence of this?
So we have sworn testimony of a number of people who saw it. There was Don Lynham from Australia. We had notes from Alan Granger from the accounting firm BDO. These were minutes from 2007 on BDO letterhead that was entered as evidence of basically Craig explaining the timeline that he would write the white paper and issue code. He was actually attempting to make it a BDO project, and BDO rejected it, which is why Bitcoin became what it was, issued by Satoshi Nakamoto. There was tons of email evidence. There was lots of emails between Dave and Craig talking about, hey, what should we call it? Bitcash? Should we call it Bitcoin? I need your help with some of the trimmings here. A lot of stuff like that. A lot of stuff entered into evidence. A lot of sworn testimony. We also had sworn testimony of cryptographic proof from Gavin Andreessen, who was the lead developer of Bitcoin after the exit of Satoshi Nakamoto. And people contend that Gavin has reneged on that, but it came back up in court under oath, and he said, no, I didn't like the way that I was treated, but ultimately I believe that it's much more likely than not that Craig Wright is Satoshi, and that I saw a cryptographic proof of him having Satoshi's keys. So
what do you mean by cryptographic proof?
So it is a little bit computer science-y, but if you have private keys and a public key pair, you can designate a message, and if everybody knows the public key, you can decode the message using your private key, showing that you are the holder of a specific private key. This is commonly used, or used to be more commonly used, in PGP, which is a concept that made its way into Bitcoin. So rather than moving coins, which is one way to prove that you can control coins, is to give a pre-designated message and prove that you're the one that can decode it, essentially, with your private keys. So it's a little bit complicated, but in math circles, people would agree that is an attestation of identity or holding a certain private key.
This is what I'm wondering, and we can talk about the history of the founding of Bitcoin up until the court case. If Dr. Wright wanted to be anonymous, which I presume he did because he chose a pseudonym of Satoshi, why is he coming out into the limelight now and fighting for his right in a very public way?
Sure. Well, to be fair, it was pseudonymous. So he was not trying to be anonymous, but he was trying to be private. So he didn't want to be a public figure. But as we learned in court, there were 20-ish people who knew that he was working on Bitcoin and knew that he was basically Satoshi Nakamoto. So it wasn't something that he was hiding per se. This included family members. This included work colleagues. This included employees of his, accountants, and in fact, the Australian tax office. So what he didn't want is to be a media sensation. And ultimately, the way that things came out, we discovered in the case that the doxing of Craig Wright, which is a pretty famous event, late 2015, Wired and Gizmodo magazines published a story saying Craig Wright and maybe Dave Kleiman are Satoshi Nakamoto. Craig was never sure where that information came from, like how it leaked out, but that's when he became a public figure. We discovered in this case that it looks like Ira Kleiman, in concert with a couple of employees at Craig's companies in the country of Australia, as well as working with the Australian tax office, seemed to have basically colluded to out Craig as Satoshi Nakamoto to put public pressure in order to actually build up precedent for this lawsuit. So it's a weird one.
Let's talk about the details of this lawsuit. So Kleiman versus Wright, it was ruled in favor of Wright. What exactly did he win? Let's be specific here.
So he was being sued for, depending on how you measure it, somewhere between $300 and $600 billion worth of intellectual property value, bitcoins, and all, and plus punitive damages and whatever else. Ultimately, IRA was saying that the intellectual property that helped create Bitcoin, helped create Bitcoin mining software, and then ultimately made it possible to mine Bitcoin, was created at least 50% by Dave. In the trial, we had nothing but circumstantial evidence of that, and ultimately the burden of proof was not met according to the jury, and the jury thought that it was very clear that while Craig had the ability, the credentials, the time, and evidence of Craig working on these things, there was just no evidence of them working on it together until a very late stage. The only evidence was essentially, hey, Dave, this is basically ready to go. I could really use you to edit this white paper. Maybe help me bootstrap it. Hey, maybe you can help mine, but not mine in a partnership. It's hey, man, fire up a laptop, mine it. We need nodes and you get paid to mine. So it seems very much like good friends who did work together, sort of, but they were definitely not a legal business partnership. And that's how the jury in Miami found it.
Well, skeptics of Dr. Wright would say that the trial proved that, I guess the outcome of the trial proved that Kleiman did not, in fact, work with Wright, or at least there wasn't enough substantial evidence to prove that Kleiman worked with Wright, but it doesn't prove that Wright worked on this alone, right?
That is what critics say, absolutely. By the middle of this trial, and I was at every single day of the trial. There was 15 days of trial. There was 7 days of deliberation after. There were a couple of holidays spotted in there. It was a good 75 hours or so of watching evidence and testimony. And by about 4 or 5 days into the trial, I started to say publicly, man, if Craig Wright is not Satoshi Nakamoto, he's been pretending to be since 2006 or 7, and has done almost nothing else since. It's frankly... I don't know when he would have had time to do anything else if he was not Satoshi. The whole thing just really doesn't make any sense. And ultimately, the attorneys on both sides and all of the research that went into this. Ira Kleiman was able to procure funding in order to get this litigation. So there's been a very serious group of people researching this case before it went to litigation. Into litigation, there was multiple rounds of settlement discussions that went in before this actually went to trial. And over the course of about 3.5 years before this went to trial, everyone that looked at it said, absolutely, it is worth suing Craig for Satoshi's fortune. So either everyone's a fool or there's at least as much evidence as is needed to say, hey, man, we're going to spend $50 million to try to get this multi-billion-dollar fortune. So
what's interesting to me is that nobody else that I know of has come forward to challenge Craig on his ownership, right?
No serious candidates. There's a goofball here and there that pops up, but their stories fall apart very quickly. And any real analysis of any other plausible Satoshi candidate falls apart with about 30 to 60 minutes of real research and looking at time and place and their basic skill set or the way that they communicate. Some of the things that make sense about Craig being Satoshi are the fact that he is a Queen's English speaker. He's Australian, so he speaks with the tongue of the Commonwealth, which is something that was very notable about Satoshi. Saying words like bloody as an adjective is something that you would get from an Aussie or a British person, and that's how Craig speaks.
Or someone pretending to be a British person.
Perhaps. But then there's also things like the background in math, economics, statistics, and all of these different things. Bitcoin is a polymath's invention, and Craig is one of the very few people on earth that has both the cryptographic experience but also the economic experience to have come up with even the idea with any real authority.
Well, just to play devil's advocate, and I'm not the only one with this question, is if Craig Wright were the original, or if he was the original founder of Bitcoin, if he is actually Satoshi, wouldn't he have the keys to the original coins that he mined? Like, why does he need to go through a trial to prove that he is the founder? He could just access those coins, right?
To be fair, he didn't want this trial. He was sued. So Craig would have very much liked for this trial to not happen, I'm sure.
I understand, yes.
He's become a more litigious character over time as people continue to say that he's a fraud, and he just keeps saying, okay, well, sue me, I guess. And but yes, in the most simple sense, right, if you're Satoshi, sign or move coins. They're your coins, right? But one of the things that came up in the trial is the fact that they're not Craig's the person. They are Craig as an officer of various business entities. And some of these coins are also held, or quite a bit of the coins are held in trusts. And these trusts specifically are set up so that Craig is not a trustee. And a lot of this is for protection reasons and just legal, taxation and stuff like that. So he's said from the beginning, hey, I didn't ask to be outed. I was doxxed. I don't really owe the world anything. I gave the world Bitcoin. And if you don't want to believe me, I don't care. I'm not asking for anything. And so he's, particular about his privacy. And I understand that can come across as convenient. But ultimately, since 2017, when these things when this case started, is roughly when Craig started to become a contentious public figure. And so when people say, hey, move coins, he's had to say they're under litigation. Like, I can't move assets under litigation. I'm going to get nailed for conversion or whatever else in this trial. So really, Craig has only had these coins unencumbered since Monday. So
and he was hacked. You mentioned to me offline.
He was hacked at least twice that we're aware of. So in 2014, among the ATO investigation, it looks like employees of his company basically worked or colluded with the Australian tax authority, and his servers had to be rebuilt from scratch. So that was a major point where there was document loss, and all metadata basically is updated to 2014, making it very difficult to prove time and place of files that happened before that point. And then he was also hacked again, I believe it was early 2020. He became aware of a very sophisticated attack on his private server that may or may not have destroyed his private keys, but at the very least they were compromised, and that was a major issue for him. He actually has not made it clear whether the keys were destroyed or if they're just compromised or whatever. But he's been in court to try to figure out, hey, what is the legal ramification? How do I protect myself in this precedent-setting situation?
Just sidestepping for a minute. Maybe if you know the details, can you explain the details of how his keys were hacked? Because a lot of people watching the show who are crypto investors might be wondering, okay, what can I do to prevent that from happening to me?
So I'm actually a cybersecurity expert myself, or at least I was a professional myself. So I want to say that everyone is hackable. It's about cost-benefit analysis. So if you're very rich, then it makes sense for hackers to spend money trying to hack you nonstop. The best advice is look poor and keep your stuff offline. For Craig, what it looks like happened, there was some kind of listening device that was put on his home network. So he had somebody maybe come in as a contractor, maybe it was a staff member in one of his homes or something, but somebody connected a listening device to his home network that was listening for passwords, and ultimately at some point a password was put on the network, it was keylogged, and it was sent out to some malicious actor. So that's a very sophisticated attack. It would have required physical entry to his home or access to his network. So it could have been somebody pretending to be from his ISP or we don't really know, but it was discovered.
Right. Well, fast forward to today. Does Craig now have the right and the ability to move Satoshi coins?
It would seem so. I don't know how long the appeals process, like how long the plaintiffs have the opportunity to appeal the decision from the court case, but it hasn't happened yet. And as I understand that, it's very customary to make that announcement very quickly upon judgment.
These coins, are they currently being held in custody somewhere?
No, they are held, as far as we know, they are the property of Satoshi Nakamoto. According to Craig, they're held in custody of this trust and or various business entities. But
somebody has those keys, right?
Presumably.
Presumably.
We believe they do. I believe they do. People argue that they do not. People would say that either they're destroyed, they've been damaged, and they cannot move, or people have said that
They've been damaged.
Craig never had them at all. Well, so a digital file, it's like a corrupted file,
Right,
for
okay.
example, would mean that your password is gone.
Yeah, well, hackers better get to work, find those keys. Craig Wright owes $110 million, according to the trial outcome. What does that mean exactly? Why does he owe $110 million?
So ultimately, there were 7 counts in the trial. It included fraud, conversion, civil theft, breach of fiduciary duty, etc. Craig was found on one of the counts to have converted assets in a way which was not good. He was found guilty on that point. The conversion of assets, however, were the assets of W&K Corporation. So they were not Ira Kleiman's assets. They were the assets of a corporation that appears to be owned at least 66, but maybe up to 75% by the Wright family. So it would be Craig Wright Investments International. His wife, Lynn Wright, was very often an officer at the companies that he set up. And then Dave was legitimately a 25% owner of that company. And so the $100 million that needs to go to W&K Info Defense, at most, it looks like about 25% would go to the estate of Dave Kleiman. But ultimately, this $100 million was procedural. And the jury made it very clear we're not assigning punitive damages to that. We believe it was a procedural mistake and not a malicious action on behalf of Craig Wright.
I believe you were with Craig Wright after the hearing ended, right? How did he feel personally? How did he did he perceive this to be a victory on his end? Man,
reading the verdicts down the line, you could see Craig very visibly breathing a sigh of relief, leaning back in his chair, like rubbing the top of his head with both hands, like very, very excited. It was stand up, shake hands, hugging. Craig was very excited about this. I mean, he could have essentially lost a $600 billion fortune.
Right.
So to only pay $100 million was a very serious outcome. And the plaintiffs looked, I mean, they walked out quietly. It was, they felt it as a loss.
This could make him probably one of the richest people in the world, right? The outcome, the verdict of this trial.
Absolutely. I mean, if these coins are unencumbered on paper, yeah, he is very much one of the richest men. In theory, he could be the richest man, depending on, I haven't checked the charts this morning, so.
Well, I wonder if he was the guy that bought pizza with Bitcoin, the first transaction ever. That was somebody else.
Actually, that's a known person. So that's Laszlo. Okay. His name is Laszlo Hayek.
You're right. Yeah, it was a known person. BSV. Let's talk about BSV real quick. What is it? You mentioned earlier in the interview that you're a believer in BSV. Why?
So BSV is the unbounded Bitcoin protocol. It is the most scalable blockchain in existence. It has the lowest fees. Every single thing across the network is proof of work. So essentially, everything that you've ever heard that was really cool about Bitcoin and Ethereum is done better, faster, cheaper on BSV. So this is smart contracts, tokenization. You can actually put applications, like full, juicy, functional apps up in the Bitcoin stack. You can monetize all data. It is a data storage solution. It is a very, very unique blockchain, but it is uniquely scalable. In fact, there are more transactions some days on BSV than there are on the rest of the entire blockchain economy combined. And it's because it scales, it does what it says it's going to do. And ultimately, it is just a re-implementation of what Satoshi Nakamoto created, meaning that the rest of the blockchain economy really never needed to be invented at all. We could have just stuck with Bitcoin from day one.
But it was delisted by a bunch of exchanges, right? Why did they do that?
A couple of things. First is drama with Craig Wright. People don't like being sued, and when Craig starts threatening to sue people, there was definitely a circling of the wagons by Binance and Coinbase and Kraken and a few others.
Yes.
But ultimately, these are the people that are kind of colluding to sue him again. So this COPA, the Crypto Open Patent Alliance, has come together to sue him, basically in order to prove that he's not Satoshi Nakamoto. So there's a real axe to grind there.
That leads me to my ultimate question as to why there is this other side. I mean, look, I'm not playing one side or the other. I'm just saying you're representing one side, one point of view, which is that Craig is Satoshi, and of course there's the other side that he is not. But if you're going to argue that Craig is not Satoshi, well, at least present an alternative to who is actually Satoshi. So again, so far I haven't heard of who that person may be. The real Satoshi, may the real Satoshi please stand up if you are watching this. But my question is, why the dissent? Why the disagreement over the evidence that at least you have presented?
Sure. I think the best thing to do is to look at Coinbase's public offering documents. And they listed a few reasons why it might be a bad investment to invest in Coinbase or cryptocurrency in general. And their main point was that Satoshi Nakamoto is the largest holder of Bitcoin. And if he were to reemerge, he would have so much control over the markets that he could dump the entire market down to basically zero. He could make it a valueless investment. And so there's a gigantic existential risk that if Satoshi Nakamoto does not believe in the investment thesis of all this stuff that they've built, that he's a very dangerous figure to their wealth and their power and what they've been doing. And I don't blame them. So if Craig Wright is Satoshi Nakamoto and does control those keys, he's said plain and simple, I do not like that it has become essentially Ponzi scheme, illegal gambling. He does not like the tax evasion aspects of things that have occurred in the blockchain economy. He advocates for a micropayment system that disrupts global commerce. He wants people to build businesses that couldn't exist without the technology. And nobody's doing that. They're building exchanges and basically unregistered banks. Right. And these are the business models that have been created.
So the white paper that Satoshi wrote advocated for a peer-to-peer system, which ultimately became Bitcoin. Do you think Bitcoin has kept the original framework or the original intentions of Satoshi, or do you think it has evolved in its utility?
No, in fact, I think it has devolved. So if you look at BTC, the whatever it is today, $55,000 or $50,000 today in coin price, it's changed immensely. The fees have gone up. It has become less useful in business than it was a decade ago. And ultimately has had everything stripped away from it that didn't make it a good investment for the venture capital partners that have turned it into what it is. And what it did is it created the opportunity to create other coins to trade. So this is your Ethereum, your XRP, et cetera. So now you're creating market opportunity to play with volatility. And that's what the people really want out of it. They don't see it as an opportunity to make some data intense business and create a data integrity opportunity that you can sell back to the economy. That's a lot of work. You could just buy a coin, wait for it to go up, sell it or do something else with it. And you're very rich with very little work. And so the peer-to-peer cash system part, I think, has been heavily ignored, and it's to the detriment of the whole global economy. It's an amazing invention and we're not using it. It's really unfortunate.
Well, let's go back to that risk you mentioned earlier. If Craig Wright were actually Satoshi, do you think he would dump the majority of his coins?
He may. I mean, when he's been angry about people's attitudes, he's threatened it. So, when somebody calls him a liar and a fraud and a scammer, he's like, I could wreck this entire industry, and I don't. So, he may. I mean, if he owns the assets, he has every right to. It's his property,
of course.
But I don't think when he's in a normal mood and in a normal business situation, he looks at it and says, "Look, it may be one of the richest men in the world. I don't want to destroy the world or other people."
What was the market value of his coins again? Supposed ownership of his coins?
So at the peak, I think they were worth about $75 billion of just the coins that we know that Satoshi has. Right. So yeah, pretty good chunk of change.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. Wow. Yeah, life could be worse. Let's end it here, Kurt. So I'm going to give you 3 possibilities, and we're going to just evaluate each one quickly and maybe assign a probability. I mean, just it doesn't have to be exact hard, science behind the numbers. Just less than 50, greater than 50. So there's basically 3 outcomes from what I've gathered. Basically, Satoshi could be dead. Satoshi could be somebody else besides Craig who wants to stay anonymous because he hasn't come forward to challenge Craig Wright yet. Or Satoshi could be Craig Wright, right? So let's go through these 3 outcomes or 3 possibilities. Satoshi being dead. Do we have any literature pointing to that outcome?
So Dave Kleiman is dead. Dave Kleiman helped with the white paper, as I understand it. There's also a David Reese who helped with the math, some of the high-level cryptography stuff. He is dead. And then the guy that actually helped make the software finally stand up. Craig is a good programmer, but not a great one. Hal Finney. Hal Finney made it right. Actually work, and Hal Finney is also dead. So
okay.
It's like, how do you keep a secret between three people and two of them are dead? Well, Craig happens to be in the position where everybody who seems to know the whole story is dead. So we have Craig.
How did the name Satoshi come about? How was that created?
So if you believe Craig, so Nakamoto is a Japanese economist. He's basically the Japanese Adam Smith. He's a free market capitalist philosopher. And then Satoshi, I don't even know if he was joking, but he said it had something to do with Pokemon and whatever else. Craig is a big fan of Japanese culture. Okay. So he came up with it on his own.
I don't know any Pokemon called Satoshi, but maybe I only know the original 150. I don't know about the other ones now.
I think he said it was an anagram of the Japanese pronunciation of Ash Ketchum, but this is way above my pay grade.
Okay. All right. What about the second possibility that Craig Wright is indeed somebody else who chooses to stay anonymous? Of course, if that entity or person or organization wants to be anonymous, they're doing a fine damn job, I may say.
Yeah, I mean, if the real Satoshi's out there watching Craig Wright and all of this stuff, I don't know. It's pretty weird that he would care so much and build this thing and participate in the community for 2 years and really have a big passion for what Bitcoin is, right, and then not have an opinion during the whole Bitcoin civil war and everything. Like, man, say something. If you're out there, doesn't care.
Maybe he just doesn't want the $65 or $70 billion worth of coins. Maybe he wasn't in it for that, right?
It's a possibility, but I'm a human nature guy, and I don't see human nature making that an obvious possibility.
I don't mean to make conspiracy theories, but maybe it's a government entity that wants to remain, separated from what people are talking about. They don't, like, the government entity doesn't want to be identified, basically.
You know what? There's a million maybes, and the rabbit holes are fun, but I'd rather do it over drinks than over over video.
Finally, Craig Wright. Okay, we've talked about Craig Wright extensively. What does he now need to do to prove to skeptics that he is indeed Satoshi? If Craig Wright is, in fact, interested in actually proving that he is Satoshi.
I think for some critics there will never be sufficient proof, but I do think he would win. He would win the hearts and minds of a lot of people in the middle by moving Satoshi coins. I mean, if he were to do that, there would be no reasonable person left who could say that it isn't him. However, he's winning tons and tons of hearts and minds now with the proof that we've seen. I mean, there's an incredible amount of evidence that we've seen. Just, again, sworn attestations, tons of physical evidence. Sworn testimony from people who he's done signings for privately. But yeah, I mean, as a fan of all of this, and as someone who, I'm a historian and I get to get a big bump and talk about really cool stuff when it happens, it'll be a pretty big day when and if Satoshi coins move and all of that.
All he has to do is move one coin, right?
One Satoshi, he can make a 25-cent transaction, and that is what it is. Yeah.
All right. Kurt, I really appreciate you coming on the show. Excellent insights. Great history lesson from the Bitcoin historian. Thank you, Kurt.
Thank you, David. I appreciate it.
And thank you for watching Kiko News. I'm David Lin. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel.